Welcome, Andrew. Welcome to
Happy to be here.
Filmwax Radio. Yeah, thank you. Well, I first of all saw Computer Chess at True False.
Mm-hmm.
That was a joy. For one thing, it was not a documentary.
No, not quite.
Yeah. Were you there?
I wasn't there.
You were not.
I was there. I was live via Skype.
Oh, okay. Like in my case, people prefer that. So unfortunately today you don't have that advantage. But I think it was South by Southwest where I saw you. That would make sense, right?
I just walk out my front door.
So speaking of front doors, you grew up in Boston, right?
For the most part, yeah. I moved around a bit as a kid, but mostly ended up back in Boston over and over again.
Was it like a stray dog thing where your parents would take you on a vacation and let you out at the...
we lived in Northern Virginia for a few years when I was younger, and then we lived in Florida for a year in high school. And for a long time, it seemed to be the pattern of my life that I would leave Massachusetts, come back, leave, come back, leave, come back. So I'll never be fully convinced that I've broken its orbit. But it's been about 5 years now since I last lived there, and who knows.
Well, that's pretty recent, actually. I wasn't under the impression that you had still been so connected to that area. It seems to inform computer chess because, the tech industry there was such a high concentration. Just
certainly, yeah,
right nearby.
One of the hubs, and yeah, I think I just saw one of the reviews of our movie that said that for a movie shot in Austin, it sure has a Boston vibe. But then, when I made a movie in New York 10 years ago and we were looking for locations, one of my producers made fun of me for getting very excited when I managed to find what seemed to be the most Boston-looking apartment in New York to shoot our movie in. So I guess that it's in the blood, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Did that actually inform you at all? Or living in that? I mean,
who knows? I mean, certainly I was, for a lot of this movie I'm drawing, we never specify the date in the movie, but sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, so that's, when I would have been a very young child. But I am drawing on certainly whatever vague, hazy memories I have of that time. And so, I would imagine in ways that I haven't quite thought through, I'm sure that where I was geographically probably informed a lot of my exposure to what was the tech at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why we're here today, Andrew.
Let's dredge it up.
I thought it was interesting that you counterpointed the computer incipient sort of movement with encounter therapy and this kind of group therapy, this sort of touchy-feely thing, because that would be the other culture that was emerging.
Absolutely.
I felt it had a very California vibe as a result.
Sure.
And because, there was a Caltech student there, so I thought they were all West, but... and I love the way you use the camera that you chose to film this.
Thank you.
With actually as a kind of almost makes a guest appearance in that bigger group session later.
Yeah, we we also never, in addition to never specifying the year, we never specify exactly where the movie takes place. It theoretically could be anywhere in the States.
Sure,
it's a it's in kind of Nowheresville hotel off the highway somewhere. And certainly with the. Again, with this kind of amorphous time, I like the idea. I think there tends to be a pop culture view of history, in which we say, okay, the 50s were about hamburger shops and Elvis. In the 60s, everyone turned into hippies. In the 70s, everyone went disco dancing, and then the 80s, everybody started playing Pac-Man. And I feel like, obviously, in real time, our experience of these cultural moments is much more fluid, and so I like the idea of, it's not necessarily obvious to put the computer folks and the encounter group folks in the same place, as like they were. And certainly in Northern California today, I think, echoes of both of those cultures resonate very loudly within each other, too. I mean, that's the fascinating thing to me, is how much of hippie culture via Northern California did seep into tech culture and vice versa. So I wanted to play with that contrast for sure.
When you were a kid and living in and out of Boston or what have you, where were you in terms of geek culture and tech culture? Was that something that was on your radar? Were you into video games?
A little bit. I mean, never hardcore. I've never really been a real computer guy. I probably, when I was in elementary school, my best friend was a guy who we liked all the same stuff, and we liked all the same computer stuff and everything, but he was obviously a little more committed to it. And as far as I know today, I think he's like a big shot at Sun Microsystems, and I don't know. There's some story I think the internet went down in Mexico, and he was the guy they called to say, get the internet back up in Mexico. So obviously, I should have done that with my life, but I didn't have that passion for it.
So then what were you doing? Were you like looking at a lot of movies? I mean, first and foremost, I was forever shall be a movie nerd. Yeah,
and that goes back as long as I can remember.
Does it?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
I have no clue.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
So your folks weren't
my folks were very all too liberal. Looking back, it's kind of shocking to me, and especially now that I'm a parent, what they let me watch. A movie like Conan the Barbarian is pretty brutal, and a 6-year-old probably shouldn't watch it, but I did, and I loved it, and so I was exposed to all of that stuff, and was completely enamored of it. And again, this is as far back as my conscious memory goes. I love movies.
When did that sort of crystallize? I could do this.
I guess it was gradual. I mean, I still don't know if I can do it, but I.
That's honest, but we don't agree.
I also think there's a great culture in Boston and Cambridge for film revival and film awareness, film history, that would definitely appeal to somebody who had any interest in film. Sure. You had this mecca available to you that one didn't have in other places.
Absolutely. Well, and once I hit adolescence, and it dawned on me that there was something beyond the multiplex and Hollywood fare. Once I realized that there was such a thing as a quote unquote art movie, and started discovering places like the Brattle Theater in Cambridge and the Coolidge Corner Theater,
sure,
and later the Harvard Film Archive. That's a tremendous wealth of riches.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was growing up, and we didn't use the term art film because there wasn't the alternative that made you, we didn't have something necessarily called blockbusters until well into the but as in terms of so much part of the culture. I mean, yes, Jaws, of course, started in the late 70s, of course, but we didn't call them art house films because they were just film. But I actually lived in Boston in the early to mid 80s, and we had the in the Harvard Square you had the Revival House, and you could see endless, always the sort of the dual packaged films, and then the Brattle Theater, as you mentioned. It was during the period where they brought back all the Hitchcock, that period of films from Rear Window and Vertigo that had been out of circulation for a number of years for legal reasons. There was a lot of film going on there,
right?
And so, I've been shying away because I wanted to, not alienate you, Andrew.
But now you can alienate me.
No, now that we won you over. Right. But by using that M word, because it's already such it became so quickly, mumblecore became such an anachronistic, such a dated term.
Sure.
Because it was so much of its moment, yet. You made Funny Ha Ha, and you essentially were right there at the beginning of this low budge, whatever we do want to call it, movement. And
although to me,
please do.
There's always I always found something slightly absurd about the notion that I started anything with those movies. Because the idea that I was at the beginning of a low budget. Well, what about the previous 80 years of low budget filmmaking?
Sure.
So and certainly when I was making Funny Ha Ha, I felt like. Obviously had no notion that we were kicking off anything. I really felt like we were coming very late, that I was making the last indie movie of, something that should have been made in the early 90s or late 80s. Like this was much more the end of something than the beginning. I mean, there we were doing this very kind of old school 16mm production at a time when that was already becoming anachronistic, or largely had become anachronistic. So I felt much more on the tail end of a movement than the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, people, I guess journalists especially, since they probably made up the whole term to begin with and the whole story, the arc of it, they love the they have to kind of package it in some way. So, it seems as though in that moment, though, there was a type of storytelling, anyway, that sort of seemed to take.
In retrospect, I can kind of see
that.
I mean, the word has, for me, it's been fascinating to live through... witness the birth of a neologism like that, because that word came. Eric Masanaga, who is a sound mixer that I've worked with for many years and worked on all of my movies, we were at South by Southwest in 2005, and the first rumblings of this thing, some blogger had made a posting that said, I think between Andrew's movie and Swanberg's movie and the Duplass's movie and Four-Eyed Monsters, there's a new movement afoot. And so I said, Eric, this guy's saying we're a movement. What would you call that movement? And he just rolled right off his tongue. He said mumblecore, and I thought it was funny. And I took it as a joke, and then I made the grave error of repeating that joke to a journalist. And if you go back to that interview, I think it was with IndieWire, I forget, but to the journalist's credit, that he puts that in full context. I make it clear that by no means do I think that there really is a movement, and if there is one, by no means do I think that this is the appropriate name for it. But that just kind of lay dormant for a couple of years, and then in 2007, when Swanberg put out Hannah Takes the Stairs, that was the moment when that really crystallized and people really latched onto that word. And for me to see it, I was in Berlin in February, and I had journalists from all over the world, from Europe and from Asia, asking me about mumblecore, and it was stunning to me. For the rest of my life, no matter what I'm involved with, I will probably never be associated with something which has had such a wide reach as that word.
Right, you'll always be associated with that.
Sure.
So you may as well.
Yeah, of course.
It will be your epitaph.
It'll be on my tombstone.
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. It's a tombstone word
for sure.
Well, let's not.
Let's
slow down
start
here.
carving that now. That's fine.
Well, it's interesting because I hadn't thought about the journalist side, because I think when you mentioned IndieWire, I think that kind of started not that long. So in a way, it was their baby in a sense, or it's something that they could kind of help foster and discover. It was a real sort of generation that everybody shared, and maybe that was part of why it did take off.
Lord knows. I mean, I'm sure that plenty of folks out there are looking for a movement. You spend all this time in the shadow of, or growing up with great, whether it's any kind of movies or music or anything. You look at these thrilling movements in pop culture history and say, well, I want a piece of that. I want my own movement. Mm-hmm. And so people always seem anxious to invent one.
Yeah. And I think there was another sense of community that I know has existed, of course, in pockets all over the world in terms of filmmaking. And, in Iran, you can see it.
Anthology Film Archives has always celebrated one movement or another of people who were making film against the grain and against the main and all of that. But I think there was this symbiosis with IndieWire and mumblecore that, emerged. Right. Just the way we're seeing in fashion this trad movement, which is just, the same, heritage clothing. What is it? It's conservative, preppy clothing that everybody's worn forever.
Right.
But it's embraced, and then they run with it and give it a name. And
right.
I think people need these neologisms because they're kind of it's a way to make your mark on your generation, and I think that's what's happened. But I think there was also this complicity with technology that enabled people to become suddenly filmmakers.
Sure.
I mean, from Dad's camcorder to the full-blown array we have now, where we've gone completely digital.
Right, and which is great that you brought that up, because it kind of does come full circle into computer chess, which becomes a kind of a meta point in your film, where you actually used those vintage cameras to shoot the film.
Old school,
by and large.
Yeah, analog video cameras. The Sony AVC 3260, which is a kind of precursor to the famous Portapak. And before I knew anything else about this movie, this movie began with the spark of a fantasy that I wanted to. I wondered what it would mean to go out and try to tell a narrative story in the visual language of these old analog tube cameras. Yes, I'd seen
on William Eggleston, the photographer.
Yes, Michael Almereyda did a terrific documentary called William Eggleston in the Real World, and in that documentary he interpolates some clips of Portapak footage that Eggleston shot in the 70s, which later, I think maybe after Almereyda's movie, these hours and hours of footage were edited down and released as something called Stranded in Canton, which is amazing, and that made a big impression. I mean, certainly seeing those images, I think, was what really sparked me to this particular camera. Like, okay, this is I want to dig up some of these and figure out how you tell a story on one of these.
So in a way, you needed to a break from maybe I shouldn't put words in your mouth. Were you making a concerted effort then to break from certain structures that you found yourself as an artist? Mm-hmm. That maybe were becoming less challenging. I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Subconsciously, I'm sure. I mean, this was a long held fantasy project, and I honestly don't remember when I first started to dream on it. I know that it was a kind of place of refuge for me for many years, as I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to figure out how to make a living and trying to figure out how to participate one way or another in the commercial marketplace. And I have very little. I don't have great natural instincts for it. So when I am feeling infuriated or driving myself crazy from trying to figure out how to sell out, I would kind of step back and take a break and just fantasize about the craziest, least commercial movie I could imagine, and that was this one. And for whatever complex series of circumstances and wherever we were at, the stars aligned 2 years ago to say, all right, let's just try to do this now and see if we can survive it. And so it wasn't so much, it wasn't a conscious kind of I need to turn the page and do something I've never done before. This was just a fantasy that had been there for a while, and then and suddenly it seemed like the time to do it. Now, it's nice that, I'm such a contrarian. The problem is that when I put out Beeswax 4 years ago, I started to see, it seemed like the general tone or tenor of the reviews was, here's the mumblecore guy, he made another mumblecore movie, here it is. And I wanted to shake everybody and say, no, it's totally different. Can't you see it's different? And now that I've made a movie that everybody says is totally different, I want to shake them all and say, no, can't you see all the common themes? Can't you see it's all the same?
Sure. Stop trying to put me in your little, container. Damn it.
I'm exactly.
Kind of. I just want to say that whereas the quote-unquote mumblecore films seem a little more Cassavetes, this felt very Altman-esque.
Sure.
I really felt like, that you were paying obeisance to him in some way, because probably not at all, but...
he's certainly in the stew with lots of other stuff. What's that?
And when isn't he?
Exactly.
But I would, dare say this movie was downright Bujalskian. Or Bujalski-esque.
Well, I will say, there was no... there was no, and not that there was in the other movies either, but with the other movies, there was maybe a little more sense of precedent. If I didn't have a specific movie in mind that I was trying to emulate, nonetheless, with the other movies, I kind of, I knew how movies felt. And this thing, I have not ever seen another movie shot on black and white analog tube video cameras. So just from format alone, I had no obvious template to. So it was a challenge in editing because it wasn't obvious how this movie was supposed to feel, and we just had to kind of stumble our way to it.
Sure. Well, I think you kind of stripped away a lot to dive into this new area. And you didn't point the camera to the sun, I hope, because apparently that's not good for the tube or something.
It's not good for the tube.
I also wanted to say that I had Florence Almozini on this show a few months ago, and I said, if Andrew's name wasn't on the film, would you have known it was his film? And she said, she thought about it for a moment. She goes, no, I'm not going to pretend.
Right.
Is that attractive to you?
I don't know.
Those critics couldn't have. You could have put a
again. I think either way you presented that to me, I'd say no. I want the other.
Yeah.
So
right, you're contrarian as you said.
I think your cinematographer had said that the technology was completely untested for a feature film, shooting some 12 hours a day. I mean,
sure.
When you received the cameras, where you had to track them down and then you got them. Really?
Yeah.
And one came in its original case with its accessories.
Yeah. Well, that was I started to at some point before I really knew that we were doing this, when it was still just a fantasy. It was a strong enough fantasy that I went on eBay and searched it, and I did not realize at the time how lucky I was. I don't remember what I paid for it, but I think it was like $50. I'm fairly certain it was less than $100 at any rate. And it showed up in the original case, worked great. It was it was beautiful. I fell right in love with it, and the fact that we later learned, once we were gearing up to actually make the movie, we thought, okay, we got to get some backup cameras, and finding the backups turned out to be much more difficult than I hadn't appreciated how lucky I was just on that first eBay search. I think we found one more on eBay, and then we were able to borrow another from a private collector who had one. So we had 3 cameras on the shoot, and from day to day, you weren't sure which was going to be But the whole thing was, I mean, there were so many challenges going into working with these, because if we had been out, when Eggleston was shooting in 1970, whatever, he was running his Portapak to a 3/4 inch tape deck, and that's the way it was done. We learned pretty quickly that was not going to be a good solution for us, because although you might find a camera that's in good working order, you're going to have a lot of trouble finding a 3/4 inch tape deck that works at all, let alone is reliable for 12-hour days on a movie shoot. So we had to rig up this. Ultimately, we decided and figured out to rig up this absurdly complex, as this nice little lightweight camera, but then that had 20 wires running out of the back of it and a cart full of equipment. So we were capturing the hard drive. It was a very 21st century operation in that way. And there have been technical headaches at every stage of this. Every time we've had to, when we were finishing the movie, when we were up-resing it, when every format we've had to master it for: DVD, HD cam, Blu-ray, DCP. There are new technical headaches every time, because none of these formats were designed to accommodate this footage.
I would love to stay in your room if you have an extra bed.
It's a couples group. I don't know if you've ever done any encounter stuff or anything like that.
Look deep within me to find what is inside you.
Don't you think it's strange that we're all here at the same time? Have you been with a lot of women, Peter?
Can you try something else? Can you try do your own move on your own?
Seems to be a little glitch here.
War is death. Hell is pain. Chess is victory.
You want to know the real future of computers?
Tell me.
Dating.
What, you mean computers are going to start dating each other?